Hi.
and thank you for giving me your time. Um, so, how are you today?
Yeah, pretty well, thank you. It's good to talk to you. Looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you. So, first thing which I want to get to is your professional title is behavioral entomologist.
Yes.
I had to Google it. I won't lie, because this is not a common thing which you just you say, oh yeah, I'm a behavioral entomologist, and you're like, yeah, I kind of know what it is. I don't know what it is. So I had to spend 3 4 minutes. So it would be better if you can explain that what it means to you and what do you do and how this field has different areas.
Okay, that's fair enough. It's not perhaps the most accessible job title, but I'm a research fellow in behavioural entomology, and an entomologist is somebody who studies insects. And the behaviour part, well, that's the behaviour of insects. So a lot of my work is trying to understand the sensory systems that the mosquitoes, which is what the insect that I study, the sensory systems that they use and how they integrate sensory cues from the environment into behaviour. So, what translates from the environment into a stimulus that would cause them to act in a certain way.
Okay. So you said mosquitoes. Is this because that's your favorite insect or
Then I wouldn't say they're my favourite insect, but they are the focus of my research.
so what is your favorite insect?
That's a really good question. There are so many really, really cool insects out there. Mosquitoes are really fascinating and really incredible in their behaviour, in their physiology, and their anatomy. And when you actually get them underneath the microscope, they're sometimes quite colourful. They're a bit feathery. They can have lots of different coloured scales on them, and sometimes you even get kind of very iridescent, disco-esque mosquitoes that look quite incredible. But I would, yeah, that's a really good question. What is my favourite insect? I have really fond childhood memories of seeing stag beetles flying around in the country lanes near where my grandparents lived. It's not very often that you see stag beetles these days, but they're so big. They're kind of got these huge armor plates on, and they really make quite a noise when they're flying around. So I have some really strong, happy memories of playing in country lanes and seeing stag beetles flying around in the summer.
Okay. So mosquitoes, of course, is focus of your research, which you are doing right now. So, I mean, before getting into more technical aspects of the research, um, what about all, because we have, as humans, have always interacted with mosquitoes somehow a lot. I mean, since I was a kid, this is the one thing which I would know that there are mosquitoes which would be there and bite you or something. So how are different myths which we hear? I mean, tell me that there's so many myths. There's just so many myths. So let's bust some or maybe like illuminate some light on them.
Yeah, so I guess one thing I've noticed that whenever I explain to people that I work with mosquitoes, everybody has a story about how attractive they are to mosquitoes, or that their husband is more attractive than they are, or that their son is completely insect proof, but their daughter gets bitten lots. Or so everybody relates to the nuisance and the annoyance that comes with mosquitoes. We can all remember a night sometime summer evening hearing that horrible buzzing drone in our ear as we're trying to go to sleep, or coming back with nasty bites from a camping trip or time down by the lake. So lots of people have a kind of understanding that there are mosquitoes out there and they can cause you a bit of a nuisance. There are certainly lots of myths. A lot of them really are to do with the kind of foods that you can eat that would make mosquitoes less attracted to you or more attracted to you. So there's plenty of kind of hearsay that things like drinking beer or eating Marmite or spicy foods or garlic can repel mosquitoes. But there really is no good scientific evidence that that's the case. So unfortunately, even if you want to have a nice pint of beer in the evening, go ahead, but don't expect that it will help you prevent having any mosquito bites.
That does look like an excuse to have
I
beer.
think it might be.
So yeah, I mean, but on the other side of it, what are some common knowledge which we hear, which happens to be true? Like after a scientific study, you find out, wow, that is actually kind of true.
Well, I think one thing that's quite well understood by people is that some people are more attractive to mosquitoes than others, and that is true. And there have been some really good scientific studies looking into this. A colleague at NRI has actually done a study with twins. So they were looking at identical and non-identical twins to see if mosquitoes were equally attracted to the identical twins, and whether or not they might be differentially attractive to the non-identical twins. And actually that was found to be the case, that the number of mosquitoes that flew towards odours, so skin odours, from identical twins was very similar, but that was quite different if they were non-identical twins, so if their genetics were different. And there's also been other studies where people have been kind of ranked according to their attractiveness to mosquitoes. And then scientists will look at the bacteria that the people have on their skin. So we know that from various studies that the attraction that mosquitoes have for individuals is really driven by odour. So the smell of an animal is really important in the attraction of a mosquito to that animal. And that's really not caused by poor hygiene or anything like that. It's just the natural bacteria that we have living on our skin. It's perfectly healthy skin. There's thousands of different types of bacteria that could be present on our skin, and they all produce slightly different odours. And mosquitoes have evolved to respond to those different odours. And some people are just, unfortunately, they have a slightly different community of bacteria that produce more of the attractive odours. And some people are lucky enough to have fewer of those bacteria, and so are not quite as attractive to mosquitoes. So that is true, that people are unfortunately either blessed or cursed with being slightly more or less attractive to mosquitoes.
Okay, I haven't found out yet, actually. I mean, I don't know. I got bitten up fair bit of deal, but I don't know. I think I'm right in the middle.
And sometimes some people actually are just more or less sensitive to the bite of the mosquito. So if you have a very strong immune response to the mosquito's bite, you might notice the bite slightly more than somebody who is not reacting to them. So it can be down to your physiological response as well, because as the mosquito is not just a syringe sucking up your blood, they're injecting you with their saliva, and you can have a reaction to that saliva, and that's what causes the kind of typical itchy, red, swollen welt on your skin.
So this is fascinating. I mean, it's so interesting that there's a different community of bacteria living, which actually varies from one individual to another. This actually kind of tells me that how much interconnected this stimuli which you were talking about, which you are studying, the visual cues and the smells and how they react, it's actually directly somehow connected to the small bacteria living on our skin. So how it varies? Like, is there a reason why there are different bacteria on different people, or is it's just millions of bacteria?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, some of it will be your exposure and environment to the kinds of bacteria that you pick up on your skin, and different parts of the body are slightly more sweaty and produce more sweat that the bacteria can feed and grow on. So sweat is attractive to mosquitoes, but fresh sweat is not particularly so, but it's food for the bacteria that can grow in our skin. So there's just a huge amount of variation from person to person, and some of that is down to their physical condition, to their age, but really I think it's quite a random process.
So in your research with mosquitoes and looking at also how it interacts with human, because there's a bit of nuisance issue, would I be right to say that it is a lot of interconnectedness, which is a small part of this ecosystem? Are you also focusing some part of your research on this aspect?
Well, I mean, it's interesting to think about it as a kind of interconnected system. So, of course, mosquitoes require a blood meal. So they are not doing it just to be a nuisance. They actually have to have that blood. And again, coming back to myths, in fact, it's only the female mosquito that bites rather than females and males. And the reason the female bites is that she needs lots of protein to develop her eggs for the next generation. So a good source of protein is blood. So the female will be driven to find a blood meal. So she's dependent on having some kind of host animal, be it a person or another kind of animal that she can feed on and get the blood that she needs to develop her eggs. So that's a kind of evolutionary interconnectedness that without those other animals, the mosquito wouldn't be able to feed and develop her eggs successfully and then produce the next generation of mosquitoes. But the main interest in studying mosquitoes, of course, is because they can transmit disease through that process of sucking up blood and then injecting saliva, which could be infected with viruses or parasites into the same person. And that has, as you say, is an interconnected thing that's happened over evolutionary time, where the main mosquito vector, we say vector is an insect that can transmit disease, the main mosquito vectors are those that really feed quite heavily on humans compared to other animals. But they do feed on other species as well, everything from cows and dogs down to frogs and birds. So it takes some comfort in knowing that it's not just humans that are irritated and annoyed by mosquito bites.
So yeah, mosquitoes are kind of vampires.
In a way, you can boil this all down to yes. But interestingly, not all mosquitoes suck blood. So there are a group of mosquitoes called Toxorhynchites, and they are really some of the largest mosquitoes. They're many times bigger than Anopheles, which are, for example, the mosquitoes that carry disease and they carry malaria. Toxorhynchites are huge, but they never bite people. So the males and females will feed only on sugar in the environment. So that could be nectar from plants, it could be fallen fruit, kind of sugary liquid that comes out of fallen fruit. So not all mosquitoes bite, and of those that do, it's only the females, and of those females that do, there's only a few that really bother people, and those are of course the ones that we're focused on.
So how big, if we say, let's say if we measure it through our finger, how big would they be?
Well, I have relatively small hands, so I don't know if that's a helpful comparison. But let's say like a typical Anopheline, which is one of the malaria mosquitoes, would probably be smaller than the size of your little fingernail. So quite small. Whereas Toxorhynchites is probably the size of maybe your thumbnail or a bit bigger. So there's quite a big difference there.
Yeah, that is big. Yeah, definitely with mosquito. So I actually never realized until I had a conversation when I was interested in one of the wetland life project, which I would refer to now, that there are different type of insects which everyone else considered to be mosquitoes. So how much of those insects are there, and do they suck blood, or they also bite and they cause pretty similar sort of irritation? So that's why everyone considers those just mosquitoes. Or are they really similar, so it doesn't really matter? It's more like a scientific term.
No, there are lots and lots of different insects that will bite animals, and some of them do it through different ways. So a mosquito, they really do have this very sharp, elongated, what we describe as a proboscis. So it's a little bit like a syringe that pierces the skin. Interestingly, though, once it's inside the skin, that needle is not rigid, it can move around, so it's prehensile, so it can find the capillaries inside your cells, move between the cells until it can find that source of blood that's flowing, and then it will pierce the capillary and suck up blood. In the UK, there are lots of other biting insects, so biting midges, which in Scotland are a particularly big problem. You can get very high numbers of biting midges, and of course overseas there's a whole other range of things like sandflies, tsetse fly, and they can bite through various different means. So some of them will create a small pool of blood by kind of rasping at the skin and then lap up blood from that rather than injecting a sucking device into the skin. So there's lots of different insects that can cause biting nuisance to people and animals.
So female mosquitoes and those ones who rely on blood, and you said that how evolutionarily this is interconnected. So is there some sort of a difference or between primates in general and the mosquitoes and other mammals, or there is not really any scientific difference?
There's quite a big difference. So as I said, some mosquitoes will really just feed on people. So Anopheles gambiae is the main malaria vector in Africa, and the female of that species will feed almost exclusively on humans. And that's what makes them such good disease vectors, because they will pick up a disease from one person and transmit it to another. Now, they have a very closely related species called Anopheles arabiensis. In fact, morphologically, you can't tell them apart. They look the same. You have to do a genetic test to see if they're Anopheles gambiae or Anopheles arabiensis. And arabiensis will feed on cattle as well as humans. So that makes them a slightly less powerful vector of disease, because they might feed on a cow, which is no problem, and then on a person, and then maybe become infected and then go back to a cow, which again is not so much of a problem. The diseases that they carry tend to, for malaria, tend to be human malaria parasites, which means they're just transmitted between humans. But I have spent some time working in Malaysia on a fairly recently discovered malaria parasite, which was originally found in macaque monkeys. And that we have found is transmissible to humans. So it goes to show that the kind of close relatedness between humans and non-human primates is a potential avenue for new or emerging diseases.
Is there any particular reason why certain mosquito species got more closer, or not? I don't know how to put it, but they had more taste towards primates, human or non-human?
Well, it's all really dependent on the environment that the insect is evolving in over very, very long time periods. And in the rainforests of Borneo, which is where this primate malaria originated, then of course the mosquitoes are mostly spending their time in the same environment as macaque monkeys. So there's a strong spatial relationship between the two species. So over time, that's turned into a stable kind of disease transmission cycle between macaque monkeys. And in that particular case, what's happened is we've changed the landscape quite rapidly in that area of the world, largely through deforestation and cut and burn clearing to make way for plantations of crops like palm oil. And that rapid environmental change has really changed the interactions between lots of species, but also between macaque monkeys and the mosquitoes that were transmitting this macaque malaria, and people coming into that habitat much more frequently. So as we change the landscape, we're also changing the disease transmission dynamics quite rapidly and on quite a large scale. So these kind of new emerging disease events are likely to occur.
Okay. So yeah, this is funny that we do change a lot of environment and then we try to find the cure for it, rather than try to get to the source of actually understanding why the actual outbreak happened. I mean, you must have seen this happening so many times because you've been working in the field. Is this something which is happening these days? Is it that we understand things more on a reactive level than to actually go into the complications, which is always harder and it's more nuanced and there's no proper answer to that? So that's why we always tend to maybe react to things.
Well, I mean, that's a huge question. I think quite often in terms of medical entomology, so dealing with insect-borne diseases, we can be somewhat reactive. There's so much complexity in these relationships that we don't fully understand, that until the situation arises, it's almost impossible to predict that these sorts of things will happen. But on the other hand, there's a huge amount that we do know about malaria, about other mosquito-borne diseases like yellow fever, and we have vaccines for yellow fever. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and as the situation changes from place to place, and even things like insecticide resistance, where we're doing a really good job of controlling mosquitoes, but maybe they're starting to develop resistance, we can't necessarily predict exactly how that's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and what the precise consequences will be. So there's always a place to be asking these questions as we're going through, trying to make sensible predictions, trying to prevent making mistakes that perhaps we've seen in the past, but also dealing with unprecedented circumstances or change that we weren't expecting to happen, and making sure that we can try and understand the basics of what's going on, and then hopefully give sensible ways of dealing with it.
One segue, which is you said that you must be trying to understand and go in and research, and you're sharing it with the other colleagues. Is there anything which you think recently, what you have seen in your field with other researchers, which would spill over to another field, and you think would actually, help them understand? Is there any topic like that which you have seen, read?
Well, I take a lot of inspiration from looking around at other disease transmission systems. So as I say, I'm focused on mosquitoes and the diseases that they transmit. But previous colleagues at NRI have done fantastic work looking at tsetse flies, which carry sleeping sickness, which is a really terrible disease, and it's almost certainly fatal if it's untreated. And their work has been a very, very systematic and step-by-step process of understanding everything about that tsetse fly's behaviour, and then using that information very sensibly, very slowly to create solutions for controlling the tsetse fly and reducing cases of sleeping sickness. And they've had huge success by taking that approach. And I think there's a lot that even we can learn in the mosquito control and mosquito behaviour world from looking at studies like theirs, to think about best ways of kind of structuring our scientific programs of research to get the very best out of them. And that's a very closely allied field. But I think part of being a scientist is always looking around you and seeing what's going on in other fields, closely related or not, just to have that inspiration. And you never know what idea you might kind of latch onto and go, that could work, or it could be interesting to think about things from that point of view.
So sleeping sickness in humans, any like small adults, maybe, it was just
yeah. If you're bitten by an infected tsetse fly, then you can develop sleeping sickness. It also affects animals in a slightly different way, but it's a real burden in sub-Saharan Africa, and unfortunately, in very similar areas that are also affected by malaria and other insect-carried diseases. So you have lots and lots of instances of insect-caused diseases in the same area. It can really take its toll on a population.
Okay, so you have observed mosquitoes or maybe other insects so close.
Yes.
I can imagine that so many hours of microscopes and mosquitoes or other insects. One of the first time I remember caring about a mosquito, I think, because generally it's just a general thing. You don't really have any individual relationship with a mosquito.
No.
Once I was listening to Richard Dawkins, and he was explaining about something else which I care a lot, and he gave an example of a mosquito, and he started explaining for like 10 minutes that how beautiful a mosquito is. And it actually grabbed my attention, so I looked more and I wanted to find out a little more, and I understood that, oh, this is really, this is a very fascinating creature which we don't really give that much credit at all, especially in our society. So for you, when you were young, how come all what we have talked about have led you to actually be this interested in all these things? You can tell me however you want. You can go from the start. You can go from one person. Is there a one person? I don't know.
So I certainly never thought that I would be working on mosquitoes. If you asked me, even 10 years ago, it's not something that I thought I would be making a career out of, for sure. I've always been interested in natural history and biology and animals and plants, and I've always been kind of fascinated by that, and science in general. And I did science at school, biology A levels, and then I didn't go straight to university. I took a little bit of time to go away and work in something completely unrelated, and then I did a degree in environmental science, because I'm quite passionately motivated to look at ways of solving environmental issues. There's lots and lots of scientific research papers about climate change and eutrophication and all kinds of environmental issues, but translating that scientific research into behaviour change or actions that will help prevent those kinds of issues is quite hard. And understanding the science, but also understanding the human behaviour that could help those issues, I found quite fascinating. And in the process of my degree, I met Professor Gabriella Gibson, who ultimately turned into my PhD supervisor when she had an opening. And it really was a kind of completely random thing to see advertised, a PhD in mosquito behaviour. And I had a think about it, and I had a read around some of the literature when I'd finished my degree, and I thought, this is really fascinating, and it feels intellectually rewarding as a topic, but something that I think, I certainly thought at the time and still do, could have a really big impact. And I think for me, the personal motivation is, yes, having a fascination for science and biology in particular, but also having that motivation come from thinking what impact your work could have. So I might not have the same motivation for studying, I don't know, butterflies, as beautiful as they are and incredibly important they are as pollinators, but I feel really driven to do something that might ultimately have an impact on people who are suffering under conditions of endemic malaria or other mosquito-borne diseases and viruses. So that for me is the kind of driving motivation and interest in this particular area, but not something that I sat at school with a careers advisor and thought, yeah, I'm definitely going to work on mosquitoes when I'm older. And if I'd known, I maybe would have done things slightly differently and been more focused on that. But I think knowing that there's a potential impact from your work is really important for me.
Yeah. So have you grown up close to nature?
In some ways, I mean, I grew up in a fairly typical suburb of a fairly large town, and but my family have always been interested in the outdoors and camping field trips and that kind of thing. And certainly I learnt a lot from my grandparents about nature and wildlife just from going on walks in the countryside, or even just playing at the allotment and looking at the birds and the insects that were playing around. And I think when you're a kid, insects are just such a great thing to learn about, because they're so small, but they're kind of easy to observe, and you just see them everywhere once you start looking. So yeah, I've always had that interest in biology, and I kind of thought about doing biology when I was younger. But I didn't really understand what I would be able to do with biology if I wasn't going to be a doctor or a vet or something like that. So knowing that that can lead into something like research, I had no idea about at all. But I'm really glad to be in that position now, and being in a position to use what I know and discover things, understanding all the stuff we don't know, and asking questions to move kind of the mass of knowledge forward.
Any childhood memories? Do you have any particular ones? I mean, no pressure, if you can think of any.
No, I think other than I say kind of playing on the allotment that my dad had, and my granddad had an allotment as well, and spending time in the garden. I would make snail farms and collect all the snails up in the garden and put them in a big tank with lots of dirt and leaves and things, and watch them for a few hours and then let them go again. And we had school frogs and that kind of stuff. So just enjoying observing nature and being outdoors. I've always enjoyed being outdoors, and I think I'm really lucky to have a job that means that I can spend some time outdoors rather than, a lot of my time is still at the computer and analysing data and writing reports and papers, etc. But to have an opportunity to work outdoors is great, because I really enjoy that.
So your work is, a lot of it is outdoor, and you have done a lot of research, I think, in different parts of Africa also.
Yeah.
So now, I mean, I saw some of the research, and definitely it is something which I don't think most of the people understand, that how much it would affect some population, sometimes large number of population who are living there. So if you can explain more about your particular research what other projects have you worked on, or what is you're working on now?
I think having an opportunity to work overseas is hugely important to me. It's a privilege. It's a huge responsibility to go out and make the best use of the time that I have overseas. But over the years now, I've developed a lot of experience working abroad, and that started when I was doing my PhD. So I'd done a lot of laboratory work, and that's great, but it's really important to validate what you find in the lab and if it actually applies in field circumstances as well. So as part of my PhD, I went to Burkina Faso, which is a country in West Africa. It's not very well known as a country, but it has endemic malaria, but also some excellent research institutes, who my supervisor was closely related to. So I spent a few weeks in Burkina Faso doing some field work with the teams there to test some of the ideas that I'd had and some of the observations that we'd found in the laboratory. And absolutely loved every minute of it. It was such a important experience for me to see a different part of the world where the research that I was doing was immediately relevant and had potential to impact. And I remember one of my colleagues on that first trip had malaria and was just very, well, it's like a cold, if you survive it as a child, then as an adult you can have malaria multiple times and you feel quite under the weather and tired, but you can get some drugs and probably get through it okay. But for children, pregnant women and the elderly, it's a really, really serious problem. So I absolutely loved working in Burkina Faso, and I've been back very many times since then. In 2014, I was working for a month in Bobo Dioulasso, which is in the southwest of the country, at the same time as there was a political coup. The president had been trying to change the constitution, and there was a popular uprising against the then president, which resulted in complete kind of military rule. All the land borders were closed, all of the air borders were closed, so the airport was closed. There was a daily curfew. The entire centre of the town where I was staying was set on fire. The Ministry of Justice buildings were burnt down, and we were basically kind of boarded into our hotel with smoke billowing everywhere. All of the telecommunication lines were down, so people were kind of running around on their mopeds trying to see what was happening and get the latest information. So that was a really quite scary experience for a few days. And I was incredibly well looked after by my colleagues and the places where I was staying. They made sure that I knew everything that they knew was happening, and we managed eventually to get back in touch with the UK and colleagues here at Greenwich, and everyone was really, really good about making sure that I was okay and what should I do, should I stay, should I wait, should we try and get out as soon as possible. And that was a really kind of eye-opening experience, not one that I would necessarily recommend, but it really did solidify kind of a love for Burkina and the people there, because everybody was just really convinced that no, you just cannot change the constitution in the way that he wanted, and we won't have it, we won't tolerate it, you're going. And as soon as he went, everything went back to normal, and everybody just got on with life as they needed to. And so that was quite a formative experience, and I've been back since then, and we have a project there at the moment, and they're just such fantastic colleagues to work with, such hardworking teams, and incredibly talented. So it's a real honour to be able to keep working with them. But yes, since then I've worked, I guess, lots of places in West Africa. So we also have current projects in Benin and Cameroon, and they've been really great to visit. As well as collaborators in East Africa, so in Kenya, in Tanzania and Ethiopia. But the longest placement overseas I've had has been Malaysia. So I was there for probably about 6 months in total for one project. And then, as I say, with Burkina, I've been back several times since then to work on other research projects. And I think having spent such a long time there, it does kind of grow in your heart, that kind of place. And really, it's a stunning landscape and great food, which is always a bonus. But they have this really interesting story with macaque malaria and how it's being transmitted into people. So that's what I've been working on in Malaysia, and having this opportunity not just to go in workplaces, but to meet colleagues who have such different experience to you, and kind of have fantastic intellectual discussions about what problems they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and how you can complement what they're doing and what they can do to complement what you're doing is really fantastic. And I think that kind of international aspect of research, especially for global problems like insect-borne diseases, is just really essential to have a fantastic kind of global team working on stuff, and feeling part of that community is fabulous.
I mean, this is of course very important, but I need to know what kind of food they have.
In Malaysia?
No. Which food do you like the most, actually?
So I would say for me, it has to be the food that I've had in Malaysia.
Oh.
Because Malaysia is kind of quite an ethnically diverse country. You get fantastic Chinese food, Indian food, and kind of traditional Malay food, as well as these great fusions between all of these different cuisines that make things that are unique to Malaysia. So laksa is fantastic. I love a good laksa, and nasi goreng, which is the kind of staple Malaysian breakfast, which is rice, kind of deep fried small fish, some peanuts, an egg, and yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, I love Malaysian food too. Yes, we have global problems, but we do eat good food.
Everybody likes
Yes.
good food, so.
Okay, so do you think one of the experiences that you described for that martial art, kind of a stressful situation, do you think that had made your bond to that place a bit stronger in some way?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, going through an experience like that, not just as an outsider seeing it on the news, but being with people who are affected by this, not just for the moment that it's in the headlines, but whose entire future it would be shaping. The nature of their democracy, how their government works, how the people are represented. It was really interesting. It was interesting to see all of that from their perspective, and the things that they were worried about, but also the kind of pragmatic aspect. It is, Burkina in places is incredibly poor, and lots of people are subsistence farmers, which means they basically just grow the crops that they need to feed themselves and their families. And it shouldn't be underestimated the impact that it has to stop doing those things, to stop looking after your crops and your animals, and to go and demonstrate. We're very lucky that we have the right to go and protest as we wish politically. But if we take a day off work, it's really generally not the end of the world. But for people in that position, if you don't go and look after your crops, nobody else is really going to do that for you. So it was really a big deal for a lot of people to take time away from doing those activities to go and make their voices heard. So it was a bonding experience with a lot of my colleagues and people that I was working with at the time. And seeing their heartfelt emotions about what was happening, and their hopes and dreams for what would happen in the future. And there have been some issues in Burkina since then, nothing quite as bad as those few days, and I think they are slowly working their way forward, and I just really hope that it all comes right for them, and they have what they want in government, because it's no less than they deserve.
So what is the problem we have over there, and what are you or other teams are actually doing on the field itself? I mean, what are the strategies or techniques, or what are the research which is going on, and what are we hoping to get out of there?
So in large parts of Africa that are malaria endemic, so they have year-round malaria, the actual mosquitoes that carry the parasite are they tend to be night biting. So the intervention of using bed nets has been incredibly successful, and that should absolutely continue and be a huge focus for donors to support making sure everybody can spend the night underneath a bed net, because it really does reduce your likelihood of having an infected mosquito bite you. But alongside that, there are some challenges. So the bed nets are treated with insecticide, and the mosquitoes can become resistant to those insecticides. And there's also some concern that whilst those mosquitoes that come into a house and feed at night time are well controlled by bed nets, that there are other species of mosquito that are perhaps not as important for transmitting disease, but still can transmit it, but that they feed outdoors more frequently. So a bed net's not going to help you outdoors unless you want to take your bed net and do, carry it around with you for all your activities. So we really need to start thinking about how we can do some, let's call it mopping up. We can deal with mosquitoes indoors with bed nets, and you can spray inside a house and things like this. But for those few species that can transmit malaria by biting you outdoors, what interventions can we think of to deal with those? And that's a really big challenge, and we don't know the answer to that. There isn't at the moment a particularly good way of dealing with that. Lots of new ideas coming from research teams globally at the moment, which is fantastic to see, and they're getting lots of support to develop those ideas. So from my part and my colleagues, we focus a lot on understanding the fundamental aspects of the mosquito's behaviour that lead them to bite a person, be that a person indoors or outdoors, because that's the key behaviour that we need to interfere with. We need to disrupt that aspect of their behaviour, and that's how we can halt disease transmission or reduce disease transmission. So the actual fieldwork depends on the project, but we spend a lot of time looking at these, what we call host-associated cues, so that the stimuli that we as a person give off that the mosquito may respond to. So it could be odours, as we talked about earlier, but it could also be how we look, how we move. It could be the heat from our body temperature. So being able to look at all of those different cues and see whether or not we can exploit them in some way to attract mosquitoes to some kind of mimic human, get them to target something that's not a human, and then in that process, can we kill them in some way? Can we remove them from the equation, so we're reducing the number of mosquitoes that are likely to bite people?
So I remember when I was in Pakistan and there was a dengue outbreak. They were just spraying whole streets with chemicals, and I don't know what was the solution. I don't think this was a good idea, although
yeah, so that's a slightly different situation because it's a different type of mosquito. So dengue virus, Zika virus, chikungunya, yellow fever, they're all transmitted by a day-biting mosquito called Aedes. There are different species of Aedes, but Aedes aegypti is the main culprit for those viruses, and they will bite during the day. And they also tend to bite, they tend to breed quite readily in urban environments, whereas malaria tends to be more of a rural issue. And yeah, unfortunately, some of the strategies that we have really are quite as basic as fogging and spraying at whole areas, whole neighbourhoods with atomized insecticide. And they tend not to be particularly specific to mosquitoes, so they can affect other insects that are present as well, insects you might not wish to actually kill. It's a really tough one as somebody who's quite passionate about the environment, to know that you might also be killing non-target insects, maybe beneficial pollinators and things that you actually want to have around. But at the same time, you have to balance that against the human suffering, the morbidity and mortality that come from some of these diseases. So it's a really difficult thing to balance, that public health versus environmental and ethical questions, and I don't have the answer to that. No. It's a difficult topic to think about, but for me professionally, ultimately I come down on the side of public health. But all the time there are people researching these topics to try and find innovative ways of either delivering insecticides in a completely targeted way or moving away from insecticides, so that you can reduce some of those side impacts from doing those interventions.
Yeah, I'm team human. It's okay. It's okay to. Sometimes we do go a little too out of balance, maybe sometimes. Just one curious question just about this, this balance of finding out what to do. Of course, we are trying our best to find what solution we can find, so we can target, specific mosquitoes, so we don't kill off all the other species which help our flora. So have you is there any some sort of a behavior which you have read about or you have learned about, where certain mosquitoes, the reason why I'm thinking about insects, it's because insects are mostly in large number are present very close to their environment, and they, I don't know if they go so far away, but they're very close proximity as compared to other life form. Is there a behavior which you've seen where they actually abandon their species or group, some sort of a behavior, and go too much into the environment? And that is some sort of, is it an abnormal behavior? Is it, I'm just thinking when we said, like, you have seen all of our species also. Sometimes we are so much into some sort of environmental or some sort of an ideology where you're like, yeah, no, more important is to protect those insects. If humans are dying, this is just the consequence. So, is there any example? Just out of, I know it's a very odd question.
I can't think of any. I mean, certainly for insects, their central nervous system is not really going to be integrating anything into a kind of thinking about them or us, or me versus the other mosquitoes or anything on that scale. So yeah, I can't think of any.
That is the reason why I was actually interested, because if there, I mean, yeah, they're not having a subjective reality where they are having a layer of cultural information, or maybe, I don't know, we haven't found out yet, but so maybe there is some sort of a code, a virus which they get, because there are some insects or there are some other insects which actually influence other hosts to do a very mad kind of behavior where they completely do something which they're not supposed to do.
Yeah, so there are instances where the like a parasitic invader can change the behavior of the host that it's living in, and there is some emerging evidence that the parasite, the malaria parasite called Plasmodium, that they can influence to some extent the mosquito's behavior by perhaps increasing their biting rate. So a mosquito only needs to feed to produce eggs. They're not interested in spreading disease. It's not something that they're kind of actively doing. It's just a passive thing that happens when they're feeding because of their infection with the parasite. But the parasite may be increasing their tendency to bite repeatedly once they've already had some blood already. So there are parasite and host interactions. And there has been some research in the last year that shows that when humans are infected with malaria parasites, they become slightly more attractive to malaria mosquitoes. And that could be something to do with the odours that they emit when they're clinically showing symptoms of malaria. Also, they'll probably have a slightly elevated temperature, and we know that mosquitoes are responsive to temperature as well. So there are these subtle parasite-host interactions that can affect the dynamics between the mosquito, the human host, and the parasite, because all three are living and influencing one another, whether they intend to or not.
Fascinating, because I mean, I guess malaria, that's why it's such a hard thing to counter, is because I think the malaria parasite has got their system locked down for millions of years or somehow, I don't know. But do you know when that, I mean, is there any research about when it started or how?
There has been some research, and interestingly, the main malaria parasite is called Plasmodium falciparum, and that's the main malaria causing parasite in sub-Saharan Africa. And the evidence suggests that initially involved in other non-human primates, possibly gorillas. So in evolutionary time, tens of thousands of years ago, at some point that shifted from being present in gorillas to being present in humans. So it's important not to forget our non-human ancestry before we turned into Homo sapiens.
So gorillas do get infected by malaria, even now, I mean, they haven't developed any resistance or anything to malaria.
Yeah, there's lots of different malaria species. So there are 5 that we consider to be infective to humans. Plasmodium falciparum, this malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, is the main culprit for most clinical cases of malaria. The Plasmodium prefalciparum, which is the species that was found ancestrally in gorillas. But there's all kinds of malaria parasites, some that just infect birds, some that infect other mammal species. So there are, we think about our own kind of woes and our own issues with human malaria, but there are lots of other systems with malaria parasites that aren't of clinical importance to humans.
I think this would help me now to understand what are the complications you are talking about, because now these all subtleties and when this problem started, what is going on between a parasite and a host and a carrier, and who is infecting what. So with all these complications now, and you would know more, way much more, so this is better to have just this much. So now you're on the field, and so you're trying to kind of intervene to somehow solve this issue. So what are the actual techniques which are working or which you found very useful?
So one area that we're working on is developing what we're describing as a host decoy trap. The host decoy trap is something that we've developed here at Greenwich, and we have a small medium enterprise partnership with a German company called Biogents. And Biogents are internationally renowned for producing mosquito traps for Aedes mosquitoes, the species I mentioned before that will spread dengue virus and Zika and chikungunya. They're a lot easier to catch than malaria mosquitoes because they fly during the day, and we can manipulate their behavior already quite well. So we're working with Biogents to make a prototype of some of the concepts that we've developed based on our laboratory work. And that is really focusing on this idea that I mentioned before, where you have human characteristics that we know are particularly attractive to mosquitoes that are looking for a blood meal. So we can incorporate things like our body temperature. We know that from our laboratory studies, Anopheles mosquitoes, the malaria mosquitoes, will land on temperatures between 30 and 40 degrees if they can also smell human odours. So we can combine human odour smells, either from a real person who's maybe protected in a tent somewhere and we're just sucking the smells that come from them and the carbon dioxide that comes from their breath, because that's very attractive to mosquitoes. We can combine that with a thermal signature, something between 30 and 40 degrees, to try and encourage the mosquitoes to land on it. And can we then develop some technology around that behaviour to kill the mosquitoes as they're landing? We can also then combine that with visual stimuli. So we know that even though mosquitoes that carry malaria are nocturnal, they are very responsive to visual stimuli. So they'll be responding to high contrast objects. So we can combine, again, the olfactory cues, the smells, with the heat signature and something visual to then boost, again, the number of mosquitoes that we can capture. And then using those principles, there are probably different ways of applying them for different purposes. And for example, if you're using that as a research tool to answer a research question in the field, you might use something slightly different in employing those 3 stimuli. If you're looking for something that is an operational tool to control malaria, and you maybe are thinking, well, we want to roll this out to hundreds of thousands of people, you'll probably be looking at a slightly different way of doing it, something that's much more cost effective, simple to use, kind of foolproof, weatherproof, lasts a long time. So as I'm kind of developing this awareness of product development, becoming a little bit more aware of some of the difficulties that come with that and how it can be quite a labour-intensive and time-consuming process to make interventions that are based on scientific evidence, but make them practical and affordable and easy to use. So we are also working with social scientists and our user group communities, so public health entomologists, local communities, to try and find ways of making our ideas translate into something practical.
Yeah, yeah. Engineers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm not an engineer, and I would never profess to be. So we definitely need to have some interdisciplinary projects where we draw on other people's skills.
So another interdisciplinary project which you are working on is Wetland Life.
Yes.
Would you like to introduce what is the project?
Yeah, Wetland Life is a project run by the University of Greenwich, and it's a very interdisciplinary project. So we have not only entomologists like myself, but historians, economists, social scientists, economists, all working together to understand the value of wetlands in England from all of those different perspectives, but with a focus on their habitat as mosquito breeding sites. So the rationale for the project really comes from a growing awareness that wetlands have huge value, both socially, economically, in terms of climate change mitigation. So many, many benefits can come from wetlands. And there's a huge drive to create or restore wetlands in the UK and globally, in fact. But there can be some concern from communities adjacent to where you might be thinking of restoring a wetland. That you are creating a perfect breeding ground for lots and lots of mosquitoes, and nobody wants that. So part of our project is looking at making sure people understand that not all mosquitoes bite people, that they're an important part of the food chain, they're an important food source for birds. So if you're going to a wetland to watch birds, you need to have some insects for them to feed on, and mosquitoes are an excellent food source. But also doing some ecology to understand the different species that we have in different types of wetland, because some wetlands are really, not a good habitat for mosquitoes. Others are slightly better. But in the UK, there are many different mosquito species, and some will only feed on birds, some will feed on people and maybe cause a bit of a nuisance. And can we understand those habitats that do have nuisance biting mosquitoes in? And can we perhaps offer wetland managers or rangers at local wildlife reserves some advice to say, well, if you have a habitat like this, you want to reduce the mosquito numbers, then you could consider clearing vegetation at this time of year or flooding at this time of year. So very simple measures that can alleviate some of the public concerns around wetlands.
So one of the things which I actually got from reading about the project and being part of it is that other research groups which are doing more research into either wetlands or forests, the approach is very different, and that's what makes me really optimistic actually, and also a bit emotional, because it's a big step to understand just as a human in your daily life that to have nature, it's not some moral obligation from some extraterrestrial code, or it's not a thing which is a responsibility which your parents have told you that you have to do it. I mean, wetland life actually literally is part of who humans are, because we have evolved in sub-Saharan Africa, and wetlands were around us maybe in some sort of way, or forests. So now even the researchers are looking to these habitats not as a device which is somehow outside and actually trying to probe and understand what it is, but they are actually looking of like what these habitats are as being completely integrated part of that landscape. So to have projects, I think, around this concept, I think it would help a lot to remove that resistance, and also this huge longing which all of us feel, but we don't you don't pinpoint it, because I think it's been third, fourth generation. Most of the people have been living in cities, so you never ever spend 1 year in pure nature. So do you think this is something which is you see around?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as part of the Wetland Life project, we're looking very holistically at the idea of cultural ecosystem services. So all the cultural benefits that arise from wetlands and associations with wetlands, be that going and just enjoying something that's aesthetically pretty, like a sunset on a riverbank, but also thinking about the food that comes from wetlands. So delicious fresh fish. That's something produced out of some wetland habitats that has some sort of cultural association. So understanding some of those ecosystem services, their place in culture, and humans' ongoing relationship with wetlands. We've always utilised wetlands for various purposes, and as you say, lots of human civilizations have been dependent on wetlands for a very long time, and being aware of the fact that yes, there can be some challenges with them. Certainly in the UK, we're lucky in that at the moment we don't have any mosquito-borne diseases. Trying to make sure that we have a good evidence base to understand the ecology, to understand the mosquito fauna that's present in different wetland habitats, and make a good effort of communicating that to people, but also thinking about those other kind of health and well-being benefits that come from wetlands to people is really important.
Yeah. So what is the future of this research? Or how are you thinking? What do you think is going to come out of this generally, long term?
Well, hopefully, we will have some good impacts from the project. We're collaborating with Public Health England because they have to deal with these mosquito nuisance issues and concerns from the public on a regular basis. And what we're hoping is that at the end of the project, certainly from ecology data, is that we can produce a set of guidelines for wetland managers. So that could be through different wildlife conservation charities or local councils who have responsibility for managing wetlands. Give them some guidelines to say, if you have this kind of wetland habitat, you might expect to find this kind of mosquito species here, or you might expect no mosquitoes, or just one species at a very certain time of year. Just so that they can either communicate that to their regular site users, give them some simple guidance about how to avoid any potential issues, so wearing long trousers and long sleeve shirt in summer evenings, for example, or to communicate effectively that actually at this time of year you're really not going to have any issue with mosquitoes. So that will hopefully relieve some of the pressure on Public Health England, who have to deal with these on a case-by-case responsive basis, so that the wetland managers can kind of do like a simple risk assessment for their site and any mosquito nuisances. We're also working quite closely with artists who are taking a very different view of wetlands, and the artistic aspect of the project is kind of still emerging, but we're hoping to have a series of exhibitions at some of our case study sites across England. So we're really looking forward to planning those for the next kind of 18 months, and hopefully they'll be open to the public for everybody to come and enjoy some of the who knows what kind of artistic outputs we'll have at the moment, but it's all being worked on presently to have a different way of thinking about wetlands and their cultural value.
Is there any research which you are working or you're about to work on? You want to share something interesting, anything?
Yeah, so my colleagues in Kenya and I and some partners from the States were about to publish a paper in a journal called Parasites and Vectors, in which we find that our host decoy traps that I mentioned earlier, you can use them with human odour, and you can catch lots of malaria mosquitoes, which is good, but you can also bait them with odours from cows and catch many more of a certain type of malaria mosquito. So that's really interesting, because there is some discussion about whether or not you can use cattle odour or cattle as a way of baiting mosquito traps to reduce the population and control malaria, or to sample the population so you can understand what's happening a bit better. So that should hopefully be published in the next couple of weeks.
So do you think it's an easier way to capture mosquitoes? That's why it's
potentially for any community that uses cattle as livestock, then obviously you have an abundant source of odour readily available. Whether or not we can tap into that to improve the way that we sample or collect mosquitoes would be really incredible to develop. So it's the first step in a long process, but that's how science works. So we take one step at a time.
Brilliant. Before we end, if you have any cute, interesting, stressful, whatever kind of story about working in the field, anything?
Well, I mean, field work is really they're rules unto themselves. If you're doing field work, you have to be prepared to get wet, be it from pouring rain or lots and lots of sweat, especially if you're working in the tropics. You can have some unpleasant experiences if you're not used to local food, or you can pick up some pretty nasty tummy bugs, and you have to find ways of being quite resilient and working through that. But fieldwork is really a fantastic aspect of my job, and certainly something that I enjoy. But it really is a challenge, and sometimes it can be really frustrating, especially if you're dealing with bad weather. Because if you're traveling, you've just got the time that you've got in the field, and you have to get on with stuff. It doesn't matter if it's 40 degrees or -5. You have to keep going. So that can be a bit frustrating, but I think if you're hardy and you enjoy the outdoors, it's not too much of a price to pay to enjoy going out early in the morning to collect your mosquito traps and watching the sunrise, and then going out again at night time to set them and watching the sunset.
That is beautiful. That is beautiful. But what is the hardest weather conditions you have been like? What do you think it was that? Oh my goodness, this was tough.
So I would say there's 3 different extreme weathers that can be really hard to work in. So one is when it's incredibly hot and dry. So for example, in Burkina Faso in the dry season, it can be 45 degrees. Your phone will turn off because it's just too hot, and that tells you should probably go in. But we do try to do work in the mornings and evenings anyway, so we're avoiding the worst heat of the day. The second would be in extreme humidity. So Malaysia is incredibly hot and humid, and the humidity just means you're just soaking wet all the time, and you can get incredibly dehydrated. So I always carry some oral rehydration salts, and if you feel like you're waking up with a hangover but you haven't been drinking, it's because you're dehydrated just through sweating so much. So being aware that you really have to keep your fluids up. And then the rest is pouring rain. I mean, it just makes everything really difficult, whether it's hot or cold. So that could be here in the UK for wetland life. We've been completely soaked through. Or it could be in the tropics somewhere where you're in the middle of a tropical thunderstorm. If you're trying to do practical field work in setting up experiments and it's really hammering it down, you just need to sometimes know when to stop pushing. Take 10 minutes, wait for it to pass, and then move on.
Perfect. I mean, this is perfect, and I guess that balance and the beauty of our environment,
Yeah.
and then the challenges which comes with it. Thank you, Francis. Thanks a lot. I